My paper is aimed at assessing the number of Israelis who live abroad, with special emphasis on those who settled in the United States and Europe, and their educational and economic attainments, and the way they construct their group identification, both their Jewish identification and their ties to Israel. And the paper is situated in two different contexts. One is that of the Jewish international migration system of the second half of the 20th century and the early 21st century. And as you can see, this largely derives from publications and work that was conducted by Professor De La Pergola, and I assume that he will elaborate on this tomorrow. I would only indicate here that over this period, some 5 million Jews moved between major continents and countries, and the direction of this Jewish migration attests to their desire to live undemocratic regimes where Jews often suffered from discrimination and alienation, especially in Eastern Europe and Muslim countries, to more Western societies which provided them with freedom and equal rights. The main destination of this Jewish migration was Israel, which became a home for about 2/3 of the total Jewish migrants. Another 1/5 moved from distressed countries to North America, to Europe, and to Oceania, and the remaining 15% of the Israelis preferred, and the remaining 15% of Israelis who preferred another country. The second context, more methodological or conceptual, is the lack of a single source of data for a comprehensive analysis of Israelis abroad, and therefore one needs to make use of several independent sets of data. Some are official, namely that of the State of Israel or of the host countries. Others are general surveys which were conducted by research institutes, and which among many immigrants, there are also some who originated in Israel. And there are also some surveys who were targeted at Israelis abroad, whether worldwide or in a specific country or area. Moreover, each such source can adopt a different definition of who is an Israeli immigrant, an objective criteria or subjective criteria, whether only native-born Israelis or also foreign-born, only the immigrants themselves or also their children who were already born abroad. But I think that despite this inconsistency, researchers today can generate pretty much a reliable portrait of the Israelis in the main diaspora countries. And our data suggests that there are today some 600,000 Israelis who live permanently abroad. This includes both native-born Israelis and foreign-born, namely Jews who moved to Israel and later on either returned to their home country or moved to a third country. It doesn't take into account the children of Israelis who were born abroad, even if they have an Israeli citizenship. And between 90% and 95% of those immigrants are Jews. And those immigrants, as we can see, constitute today about 7% of the total population at origin, namely in Israel. And over the last 2 decades, we witnessed a diminution in the share of immigrants out of the total Israeli population, which in relative terms suggests that Israelis today tend less to leave the country. I would also add that the rate of immigration from Israel pretty much resembles that of other Western countries such as Finland or Austria, and it is even lower than immigration rates from countries such as the UK, Switzerland, or Luxembourg. This is from about 10 years ago. Pardon me? Approximately half of the Israeli immigrants reside in the United States and another 6% in Canada. Western Europe is home for about 1/3 of the Israelis abroad, with a silent concentration in France, the UK, and more recently also in Germany. About 6% live in the former Soviet Union, most of whom are return migrants, and the remaining Israelis are almost equally divided between those who settled in Latin America, in Oceania, and in Asia and in Africa. And the immigrants are a positive, selective group of the Israeli population. About 60% of them have an academic education of at least a bachelor degree, as compared to only about 1/3 of the Israeli Jewish population. And with slight variations, this high rate of people with academic education characterizes Israelis in almost all countries, certainly in the United States and in Europe. We can also see, and this is based on data from an article by Inon, that the recent migrants with a duration of 5 years or less in the destination countries are characterized by significantly high levels of education. So these, I think, observations very strongly attest that Israelis abroad acquired their education already in Israel, namely what we often call brain drain. The educational attainments are then channeled into strong or high concentration in the upper strata of the occupational ladder. We can see that the proportion or the rate of Israelis in Europe that work in professional, in scientific, and in technical jobs is almost 3 times higher than their peers in Israel. And for art, entertainment, and recreation, the rates are almost 5 times higher. Moving now to the identification, to the group identification, the Jewish identification of the Israelis abroad is weaker than that of their counterparts in Israel. This is especially true for ongoing rituals and those behaviors which have a religious meaning. The differences are much smaller as far as intermittent behaviors are concerned. There are some variations between countries, and especially high levels of Jewish identification among Israelis who settled in the United States as compared to very low Jewish identification among Israelis in the former Soviet Union and in Germany. Still, Jewish identification strengthened as time abroad elapses, and we can see this in this graph for the United States, but very similar observations were also found for Israelis in Germany. At the same time, the ties to Israel, although the ties are very strong, nevertheless they weaken with the prolongation of time abroad. And these last observations on identification pretty much coincide with John Berry's theory on assimilation into local religious and ethnic identification of group belonging and weakening of ties to the homeland. This is cell C in the two-dimensional scheme. And they refute 3 alternative competitive trajectories in cells A, B, and D of marginalization, namely the weakening of both religious ethnic identification and ties to Israel, of integration, of the strengthening of these 2 dimensions, and of the perspective of separation, according to which immigrants will prefer to express or to maintain ties to the origin culture and will prevent from interaction with members of their new religious and ethnic group. And finally, I wish to add here kind of a complementary perspective. And this is the attitudes of Israelis toward Israelis who moved to other countries. And based on a survey which was conducted in 2017, and despite the fact that immigration from Israel contradicts the Zionist ideology, we can see that about 60% of the Israeli Jews believe that Israelis abroad have a positive, or at least somewhat a positive contribution to the state of Israel. Those are the gray and the yellow slices in the pie diagram. And at the same time, a clear majority reject the notion or the possibility of granting Israelis abroad with the right to vote in the Knesset elections. So I believe that this empirical findings or results have some also policy implications, and I hope that we'll have time to explore them over the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for running through this so promptly, and this gives us some time for discussion, questions, clarifications, comments, or whatever. Please.
Thank you. Very interesting paper. You had very significant ideational differences across the countries of settling, which may be interpreted as influences of the surrounding or as a selective Israeli migration to the respective countries. Following on that, how would you comment on intermarriage, both in the sense of Israelis marrying non-Jews or Israelis marrying local Jews and becoming, in fact, part of the local Jewish community?
I don't have any updated data, neither for the major Jewish Israeli concentration in the States, nor for other countries. The last figure that I remember suggested that between 10 and 20% of the Israelis in the United States are married to someone of a different faith. In Germany, in a survey that we conducted in 2015, about half of the Israelis who were married, not all Israelis are married, most of them are unmarried, but among those that are married, about half had a non-Jewish spouse. So there's a huge difference between Israelis in the different locations. And I assume, and this follows perhaps the previous lecture, that among the Israelis in the former Soviet Union, namely those who returned to the former Soviet Union, probably the rates are even higher.
You didn't have time, or you didn't make a comparison between the Israelis abroad and the local Jews. And in particular, I would like to know if you have a sense about the degree of religiousness compared. That is, are Israelis abroad, let's put it like this, more secular than the average Jew that lives in that country, or is it about the same? I take the United States as the main case where you might have a sense of what goes on there.
Yeah, again, for data that we have for about a few years ago, Israelis are more engaged, not so much in the communal activities, but they are more committed to Jewish rituals, to celebrating Jewish holidays, to more intermittent Jewish behavior. Certainly their ties to Israel, although they somewhat decline over time, they are still much higher than that of the local Jews. But as far as engagement and membership in Jewish organizations, so in synagogues there or JCC, there the proportion is much lower, because I think that the local Jewish community is not ready yet to embrace them in large numbers, although this is something that has changed over the last several years.
Yeah, thank you. So you have in one of your final slides, you show the identity going up and transnationalism going down, and you interpret this as an indicator of assimilation of Israelis abroad. But maybe I missed it, but I didn't see too many indicators of transnationalism in your presentation. So this would involve, especially concern the second generation of children of Israelis born abroad. Do they speak Hebrew? How often do they visit Israel? Do they have Israeli citizenship? Do they intend to go to the military? And so on. So do you have this kind of information?
Okay, just first to make it clear, when I use the term assimilation, I don't mean assimilation into the general local American society, but rather into the local Jewish community, okay? So it's not assimilation that they distance themselves from Judaism, but rather on the contrary, they integrate into Jewish life in some way or another, and they even strengthen their Jewish identification as compared to the level of Jewish identification when they arrived in the United States. And these data refer only to the first generation. I don't have here any data on the second generation of those children who were born there or moved to the United States when they were very little and now they're grown-ups. I don't have data on this, so I really cannot provide any reliable data on this. I think that this is something that I think that Lilach Lev Ari has more data, at least on the 1.5 generation of the Israelis abroad, but I would prefer not to quote it because I'm not sure that I will be accurate.
So this is what Protestants call segment assimilation, right? Assimilating into a segment, specific segment of society.
Segment in terms of ethnicity and religiosity into their own religious and ethnic group. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for this. Yeah, I got it. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have one question. Do you have any idea about a breakdown by gender? Do more men or women emigrate from Israel? And my second question is, do you also have an idea of, because you gave us numbers for basically permanent migration overseas, but what about those Israelis that leave, especially I'm thinking, like, I'm from Germany, so tons of Israelis in Berlin, but they don't intend to stay forever necessarily. They come for a certain period of time with the intention of going back to Israel to have families later on, so.
I think that the gender balance is slightly more men than women, but difference is not very significant. Probably depends on the country, but probably 45, 55, not something dramatic. As far as permanent or temporary migrants, this goes back to the question how we defined an immigrant, and I used different sources, and each source might have a different definition. The Center Bureau of Statistics defined an immigrant as someone who left the country and didn't return after a period of 12 months. Now, there are many that come every year, so they are not counted, although I have to say that just a few weeks ago, I attended a meeting at the CBS that they intend to change this definition. If I understood correctly, an immigrant will be someone who was away and didn't visit Israel for something like 300 days, not a complete year. Yeah, and some of my surveys are based on the internet surveys, so I don't have any control of who answered those questionnaires and whether they are abroad for 1 year or for more years, although I assume, and those were the instructions, that we ask only those who see themselves as permanent immigrants to fill the questionnaire.
So professor in sabbatical is an immigrant.
Well, it depends.
If you didn't return.
Why not?
Under the present rules, and Uzi says they will be changed,
Yeah.
If you return for one day and say hello to your family and go back, you have broken the year, and so you never left.
And usually you are
With
not.
the present rules, so you are still here. Under the new rules, it will be more realistic and more flexible.
And even if you are a permanent migrant, it's only for 1 year, right? You wouldn't be counted 2 years unless you are abroad on sabbatical for 2 years in a row without coming to visit the country.
About attachment to religion, if you're going back to FSU, to FSU immigrants, and if I understood it right, it seems like the Israeli abroads in FSU countries, yeah, they have kind of high level of attachment to religion and religious practice compared to other countries. It seems like they became more attached to religion than FSU immigrants here. I mean, if you can just go back to these numbers and why.
I assume that you refer to this graph, right?
No, to the graph before, whereas FSU 21%, 35%, it seems like the percentages of practicing, they're relatively high, because we do talk about Israeli Jews abroad, yeah, if I got it right.
Yeah.
So it's like, from what we know about the FSU group, that kind of perceived as an unattached religious group in the Israel, it seems like Israeli abroad, Israeli and FSU, it's...
Yeah. So you suggest that this rate is higher than the rate for FSU immigrants who stayed in Israel.
Yeah, this seems like...
Okay, if you say, I will not...
I don't...
I think that somewhere I do have these comparisons between the immigrants and some who left and those who are still in Israel using the 2013 Pew survey, because it was a large survey, 2014 I mean, but I have to say that I don't remember the figures, so, but I trust if you argue that they have higher, so it means that, it means that they want to maintain some kind of Jewish identification.
It seems like they, even in comparison to France or to UK, to Germany, like, yes,
I'll be very quick. I just wonder whether you checked media consumption patterns, because my guess would be that on this aspect, the transnational identity might come out at its best, saying that even Israelis saying we want to stay forever in America and we belong there, when you check what they read, they might be still very much connected to Israeli media.
Yeah, I agree with you. We examined this for the Israelis in the United States, and they consume quite a lot of Israeli news and Israeli media. They surf the internet on the quite regularly. Right.
Okay, thank you very much.